Welcome to the Learning and Development Podcast, sponsored by Infopro Learning. As always, I'm your host, Nolan Hout. Joining me today, we have Matthew Eade, Senior Director of Learning and Development, where he's leading a team of over 20 learning professionals who are passionate about creating and delivering learning solutions that really drive business performance and employee engagement, kind of the two critical factors that I love to talk about. So happy to have him on. Today, we're going to be talking about how we can leverage AI and data to help L&D better understand the business, identify those performance outcomes, rapidly build content, and measure outcomes. So as you can tell, we have a pretty full slate today. So with that, we'll go ahead and meet Matthew. Matthew, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Nolan. Thanks so much for having me. I've been listening for a while and you've had some incredible thought leaders. So I feel very humbled for the invitation and I hope I can provide some value to your listeners today.
Oh, I'm sure you were. I think anytime somebody's willing to come on and talk about their experience, especially in something like AI, people grasp onto that. I think there's so much information. Some people say misinformation. Who knows? So any stories we have, successes, failures, whatever, happy to have you on. But before we get into that, Matthew, we want to learn a little bit more about you. I mean, you obviously have a pretty large team there, but you didn't start there. I doubt you graduated and they said, here's the keys to the kingdom. How did you get into this field of learning and development in the first place?
Well, thanks for the question. I'm not much of a self-reflector. I'm usually kind of forward-thinking, but I know you've asked this question, so I had to give it some thought. And I guess like many L&D professionals, I have a sort of a non-traditional pathway into L&D. My career journey began when I was 14, back in Melbourne, Australia, when I was going through high school and I wanted a part-time job. And I started working at Toys R Us, which unfortunately is no longer
Wow.
around. But and then
Not for
shortly after
long.
that.
Did you hear that they're trying to open up a couple stores for the holidays?
I did not hear that.
I
That
didn't
is,
even read the article. This could be fake news, but I heard that they're talking about opening up a couple satellite stores just for Christmas shopping. So anyways, that might be something to check out if you live in a big city.
yeah, that could be surreal. It's been many decades since I've,
Well,
been
and
in a Toys R Us store.
yeah, and my kids have never been in one. So if they open one, I mean, the nostalgia of going into one and buying zebra gum, at least that's what I did,
Mhm.
will make hopefully pay off. So anyways, flashback, you're working at Toys R Us.
Yeah, and I came from a kind of dysfunctional family background and went to a really rough school. I know it was because I remember watching the news one day in Melbourne and they said, the best schools and the worst schools, and it was my school they had up there as the worst school. It's no longer around, but working part-time through high school was my kind of escape, and I really appreciated that. So. Um, and then I worked really hard through, high school to get into university, ended up at one of the most prestigious universities in the country.
Mm,
And, being very independent at that time, financially and otherwise. That first year at university, I kind of really struggled and,
mm,
realities kind of slapped me in the face. And I also had a bit of imposter syndrome. I kind of felt
mm,
like I didn't belong because of my background and who I was rubbing shoulders with. So I was really appreciating learning, and I felt like I was getting a real kind of broad education, a type of education I didn't feel I received in high school. And I really enjoyed it, philosophy and humanities, and developed this love of learning.
mm.
But I had to make a decision, and it was at the end of that first year in summer when I was then working at Target on the evenings and weekends, who offered me a management position. And I thought, I'm going to take a step away from school, clear some debts. But what I didn't expect was that I would fall in love with it. I really enjoyed,
Mm.
working in retail management, the fast paced nature of the business, being really connected to, very clear performance outcomes. You either made the
Yeah.
sale or you didn't. You either made budget that day or you didn't. Um, and also the development that I received, as a management employee at Target. They had a pretty strong management and leadership development program, and I guess that's where I kind of really have a deep appreciation for those types of development programs today. And I do recall that was when I learned that I am an introvert. I just always thought there
Okay.
was something wrong with me, and actually it was through that program that I identified it's not a weakness, it's actually a strength. And so I really kind of gained a deep appreciation. But nearly 10 years at Target, and I felt like something was missing. I wanted something more.
Mm,
Um, I guess I fell out of love of the role, and so before I went back to school, I decided to travel the world, which is sort of a rite of passage for many Australians. Go
mm,
live in another country and experience that. And so I moved to Canada and lived there for a couple of years and traveled around North America and South America. Had some incredible experiences, met some wonderful people. Learned a lot of skills that I still carry with me today: adaptability and resilience and cross-cultural awareness, and really appreciate the lifelong lessons that I learned, by traveling the world. And then I decided to go back home, finish my studies. I was then majoring in media communications, thinking I was going to get into journalism. I was interning with one of the biggest newspapers in the country and actually actively applying for a cadetship. The hiring manager said, basically, it's yours, Matt. Just give me a couple of weeks to
mm.
figure it out. And then, as you can imagine, in the newspaper industry, there was a decline and reductions in
Yeah,
force. And they're like, sorry, we can't offer you
absolutely.
that role. It doesn't exist. So there was at that moment in time when I had the opportunity to move to the US. I'd always wanted to live in the US, and so this opportunity came up, and I jumped at it. And moved to a new country, didn't know anyone, didn't have any connections. I was starting over again. And my first job was with this company called Avant, which was, a startup in the fintech industry of a couple of hundred employees. And I joined them in the operations function. And within a few
Mm,
months, the operations manager offered me a position as a trainer. And I was like, well, I've never done that before. Why are you proactively offering me this job? And, he saw how quickly I was learning things and applying it, and I was coaching others on the job. And so I took the role, and I kind of felt like for the first time I'd found my passion, which was
mm.
training and development,
Wow.
and then was promoted pretty quickly, and then helped the organization build out their training and development function from the ground up, and supported their hyper growth from 200 to 2,000 employees
Yeah.
within a couple of years. Built out a team, implemented programs and systems and LMS, and developed people internally into roles like instructional designer and trainer. And then, unfortunately, there was a sh- um, some turmoil in the financing of the fintech industry due to some bad actors, and we had to cut some stuff. And I took that as the hint to maybe find my next opportunity. And that's where I ended up at Empire. And the
Mm,
hiring manager and executive at the time in the interview said, look, Matt, this is basically like a 60-year-old startup. And in many, many ways, that is true. It was very fast paced, no bureaucracy. And again, I was able to build out the learning and development function from the ground up because they didn't have one. And where you called out a team of 20 today, training managers, OD managers,
mm.
learning administration, instructional design, we're doing some phenomenal things. And, when I look back, I think, the career theme is operating in very fast paced, lean environments
Yeah.
where, measurable performance really matters.
Yeah, and I mean, so that it's interesting because you started, you had such a and what industry does Empire play in?
Retail and home improvement, home
Home
services.
improvement, right? Yeah. So you've kind of gone from a lot of, hardcore, whatever I forget what they call like frontline retail,
Hmm.
um, to then shifting to startup fintech, which is or
Yeah.
finance, which is like couldn't I would think couldn't be more opposite from each other, and then back into kind of some a retail position and a little bit along the way. So lots of different industry changes, but it was interesting that L&D kind of took a hold later in that, and then it seems like once you grasped that, it really just became, no, this is it. Like this is where I want to be. This is what I want to do. What is it like, why do you think that happened? Why do you think it is what clicked and you said that's what that's what I want to do? Is it like you as a kid, like you mentioned, you went to a bad school and maybe you thought, well, I don't want any other kid to go through this again, so I'm going to be the teacher, of the of the corporation. What do you think?
Well, for me, I really like big challenges, right?
Okay.
So I
Yeah.
love learning and I love big challenges.
Right.
As an L&D leader, as an L&D professional, you have to be a lifelong learner. You're thrown into different projects and different functional areas in different industries. I know many L&D professionals do cross industries, and you have to learn very quickly on the job, what matters and what's going to make an
Mm-hmm.
impact. So you have to be always learning. But I also love doing big things, whether it was pushing myself to be the exception in my high school to go to the best university in the country, or it was to sell everything I owned and travel and move to the other side of the planet twice, to, more building out L&D functions from the ground up, taking
Yeah.
uncertainty and creating certainty. Most recently, people called me crazy because I underwent a gut rehab of a 120-year-old home through the pandemic when we had labor shortages and inflation
Oh
going through the
boy.
roof. So, I don't typically take on, small projects. So I think that's a through line. But also, there's a lot of my interests in there, kind of, interest in journalism, which took up a lot of those kind of skills of
Totally.
learning
Yeah.
and educating and teaching
And
others.
engaging people.
Engaging,
Yeah.
yep. Being really engaged in business problems and leading business issues, from frontline retail management to
True.
engaging with senior stakeholders, whether that be at my current organization or in the startup. So, I think there's a through line there. But, I think it's mostly being really attracted to taking on big challenges, and building out functions and always learning.
So one of the things that you mentioned was, how you've built these teams in kind of agile and scalable ways. And um, one of the big ways to do that is AI. Um, well, I want to get into the hows of it. I am curious to know, if you were to start over again at your last or, where you are today, if you were to start over, talk to me a little bit about what you think that team might look like. Right, because
Mm.
obviously L&D on the org structure side is going through a massive change of what does AI mean for? What are the roles? What are the skills that we need? If you reflect back on how you would build that team up today, how similar do you think it would be? And I'm putting you on the spot. This is not what we talked about, but I just had this intrigue, this question, because I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, it's budget cycles, it's timing right now. They're trying to do their next level planning. How do you think that would change?
Look, I think it would look very similar. Even pre-AI, there's, been the conversation around L&D kind of being more focused on performance and
Yeah,
and and less about, learning attendance and learning completions and things like that. So the concept of a role of like a performance analyst or even kind of learning data analysts. And, I have a data analyst on my team today who is overworked, let's say, to put it lightly. And that's because, to make sense of what needs to be done and the impact that L&D teams can have, we really need to take a look at tons of data, make sense of it to make informed decisions. So, I think there'd probably be a more heavy reliance on having talent on the team that is really great at that. But fortunately,
yeah.
Gen I is doing a lot of that work today for us, and I'm excited to talk a little bit more about that.
Lovely, interesting. So let's get into it. I mean, the first thing you talked about was leveraging AI and data to help L&D better understand the business. I just want to kind of focus on that first component because a lot of AI talk today, especially in L&D, is more. I think what I've seen is more on like the creation of assets, the development of content, the leadership code, whatever it is. How can we leverage AI to better understand our business?
Yeah, that's really the foundational starting point, right? But before I jump into that, I just do want to do a quick disclaimer on responsible AI use, right? So I'm going to talk about a
Mm,
lot of ways that I use it today and my team uses it.
yeah,
I just don't think it gets enough airtime, talking about responsible AI use. It's still a bit of a wild west out there with AI. It's
absolutely.
moving so rapidly. I think anyone who's not to, stop people from using it. I just think it's really important on the front end for every individual to be really informed and knowledgeable on the risks of AI, from ensuring, data protection is considered, right? A lot of these, particularly, freemium or freeware tools,
Yeah.
nothing is free, as they say, right? So when you put in your proprietary information into these tools, you need to question what are they doing with that. And so, I strongly recommend anyone who's not considering those kind of responsible uses to consider that. There's also, government regulation, around, for example, in Illinois, you can't record someone without them knowing. So like AI note takers and things like that.
Hmm.
But then also the accuracy of outputs. I think this gets a bit more talk and focus, but it's really important as L&D professionals in particular that, we are taking ownership of those outputs and we're putting the time into ensuring the quality of the outputs as well. So, I think it's really important, for everyone to consider, their role in ensuring the use of AI is protecting proprietary data. If you work in a business that has customer information that you need to protect, but also ensuring that the outputs are accurate. So I just wanted to put that quick disclaimer out there because I think it's really important. We recently went through a big review of what our AI policy should be, do's and don'ts, what you can use it for, what you cannot use it for. So I encourage everyone who has not taken that step with their organizations to engage with their legal teams, engage with their IT teams, and make sure that everyone's on the same page about how AI should be used in their organization.
Yeah, good call out. And I mean, as a resource, I know Matthew, Matthew Eade would love to, and he'll have his links in the bio and stuff. I'm sure he'd be happy to share what he learned. I helped write our policy at Infopro. I'd be happy to do that. I also have a good buddy who sits on the board at USA Today, who's in L&D, who helped draft their policy. And so, like, if you kind of find yourself with, yeah, I agree, but I don't really know where to begin, feel free to kind of reach out to some people who have maybe learned their lessons along the way. The one thing that I touch on that was interesting is the accuracy component, and it's an interesting one because what I tell people is, I don't know if you play. Do you play golf?
I don't. I'm sorry.
Okay. So when you use your driver, right, that's the club that you want to hit the furthest
Hmm.
thing, right? So you're hitting a tiny little ball and you're trying to hit it 300 yards, 3 football fields away. Obviously, if you make a little mistake at the
Hmm.
beginning of that swing, it's going to end 300 yards one way or the other, right? It's the mistake you make is exasperated by the power of the club.
Hmm.
Versus if I use a putter that's only designed to roll the ball, maybe you're not a golfer, but you've probably played mini putt, can't
Hmm.
make that big of a mistake with a putter.
Hmm.
I feel like AI is one of those things. It is your driver. It is one of your more powerful tools, which comes with this great responsibility of if you're inaccurate from the beginning, everything you do is going to expand that problem and expand
Hmm.
that mistake even further. Not again, obviously, I'm not saying don't use it. I'm just saying it does become, with it being so powerful, accuracy, the importance of it can be magnified as you leverage that tool more and more.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I couldn't agree more. And so I just want to preface that,
Yeah, of
and
course.
that's something that we've done internally. But going back to your question, understanding the business, right? We hear a lot in L&D about kind of moving from order taker to strategic business partner, right? And to do that effectively, an L&D professional needs to speak the language of the business. When you're in an L&D function who's supporting many different functions, that means being knowledgeable on many different domains and
Hmm.
needing to be familiar with nomenclature that is, very broad, right? So, the way I think about this is threefold. Let's say it's about doing research, both internal and external research. So let's start with external research. Gen I, and the way I use it is when I'm engaging with different stakeholders, whether it's sales or it's warehousing and distribution, it's customer service, it's operations, it's HR, IT, marketing, right? I leverage that to kind of, get some background on, what's being discussed in thought leadership circles around this topic, what's important to these types of domains, just so I
Hmm.
can get familiar with what's going on. So prepare myself for going into a conversation with that stakeholder to try to get a head start on what matters to them, right? And sure, we've had Google for a long time, but this makes speeds the process up incredibly. And even if you're on a
Absolutely.
pinch, you've got invited to a meeting last minute, and you're like, oh, I'm not prepped for this. You can do some quick research and kind of get the ball rolling, so you can speak with some kind of credibility with different business leaders. And then the internal research, right? There's a lot of data in most organizations, particularly in the organizations I work at or have worked at. So pulling that in so you can try to understand it, to understand the business better is really critical. Um, and an example of how this has come to light recently by using internal data when engaging with the business to understand the needs. A senior leader came to me and said, we've noticed in some geographies that, the sales performance of a particular product category has weakened. We don't quite understand why. We want to deliver some
Mm.
training. This probably sounds familiar, right? And I said, that seems strange because why is it only happening to these markets? Let's try to figure out what's going
Mm.
on. So what I did, I used AI and I was able to bring in performance data, training data, but also some HRIS data. Data like,
Mm.
the individuals who are in the roles in those areas, how long have they been with the business? And what I was able to find in that example by bringing that internal data and doing some research was that those markets were actually impacted by some higher turnover recently amongst the sales workforce, which meant
Mm.
those markets had a higher percentage of newer consultants overall compared to other markets. And we've known for a long time, there is a ramp to productivity. And so if you
Mhm.
have an overly distributed kind of amount of consultants who are fairly new, of course, the performance overall is going to come down. What typically helps folks when they're new is coaching and reinforcement and support and ride-alongs in the example of sales where I work at. So we were able to, rather than just say everyone needs to be retrained, it was let's identify those who are struggling, give them some additional coaching and feedback, support the local managers in those areas because they had more new hires than a manager would typically have at one point of time in time. And we actually found that moved the needle. So, that was about kind of understanding the business challenge, bringing in AI and various data points to help find a solution that was going to better move the needle than the typical let's go
Yeah.
deliver training.
Yeah. So to kind of, bundle that, it's like we went from, oh, come in and deliver, closing or negotiation skills, right? Like, oh, let's pay consultant, let's read Never Split the Difference, let's whatever, bring that guy in to talk, versus saying, no, we just need like better onboarding or management training. Like it's such a stark contrast between what the business asked for versus what they needed, and your team was that conduit to say, yeah, this is actually where the performance metrics matter. And we talk. I did, just in the last podcast, I talked about how do you kind of have these conversations with the business when they come to you with one thing, and your response is that doesn't sound like a training problem. I really like how you have said, well, that doesn't sound like a training problem, but let me tell you what I think the problem is. Like it may be a training problem, but it seems like this might be the actual problem. So I think that's really where L&D can be the star of the show is kind of them digging and doing their own research, because now that you can, and pull that thread to get to the crux of the issue and provide solutions that will work. A question on that though, and we're talking about, starting with the data element. How do you ensure that the data you're using and you're plugging in is accurate, right? Because you're pulling from sources that are, especially in L&D, a lot of times you're probably pulling from sources that aren't yours, right? They're not. So I guess, are you just like trusting the data is accurate? Do you rely on the business having cleaned it and cleansed it, or what is your traditional approach when you're trying to leverage this data that isn't necessarily L&D owned?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And, even just let's say, for example, we have different KPIs, and
Hmm.
depending on who you ask in the business, whether it's marketing or sales or finance, their definition of that KPI or how they calculate that KPI can vary broadly. So there's sort of a trust but verify approach, and
Yeah,
before making any
totally.
meaningful decisions or taking any, considerable action, there is a review process to comb into the data, consult with different business leaders to make sure the findings or the insights we've gathered from AI kind of make sense to them based on the data
Mm-hmm.
we've pulled. And you're right, sometimes AI does hallucinate. Right. There was a recent
Yeah.
example of, I was using it to summarize open-ended comments in an engagement survey or training survey where we had hundreds of responses. And it started making up quotes which didn't exist. And I said, that's actually for our blue
That's
collar workforce. That actually sounds like a really well drafted
yeah.
comment. And so when I was searching for that comment, it didn't exist. So, there is a word of caution there. And again, it can help steer you in the right direction, but you do need to follow up, verify, double check that it's accurate.
And that's, I think that's a really good mention is that especially when it's not your owned data, right? I do think just the kind of gut check of checking it back to the business. Hey, this is what I saw. Does this seem right? Is this tracking with you? But then also, I think you bring into the importance, like the understanding of the business. You have to have a baseline, almost understanding of business to understand what AI is hallucinating,
Hmm.
right? Because and I was just talking to my wife about this, and my brother, who's a teacher, and we were talking about how AI can or cannot detect cheating. Right? Can it detect itself? And I was like, well, the nature of these AI tools is they don't want it to be able to detect itself. That's how they prove that they're worth. They're like humans. And I said, so the interesting bit of it is, but a teacher, if they don't use an AI tool to determine if the tool is AI, they probably have a better understanding because they know the language of Nolan
Mm,
and they know the language of
context.
Matthew and they know the language of the people that they use. And
Hmm.
so I throw that out because I think I've talked about this so many times. So I guess maybe I don't need to throw it out, but giving AI to people that don't know the business ahead of time
Hmm.
is really tough. You're more likely to get these hallucinations because the AI tools present it with so much confidence that it'd be hard to tell it was not right.
Yeah, and there's all the tweaks that you can do, behind the scenes in the tool that you use to try to get
Oh yeah,
get it get it to provide you the answers in a format, that you're seeking. You don't want it to be kind to you all the time and make up answers just
yeah.
so it can provide you an answer. So there's some obviously tweaking that you can do behind the scenes, but you're right. It's all contextual, and you have to have a fairly solid understanding of your organization and the context to identify if it tracks, the outputs track. And but again, it's a trust but verify approach for
So,
us at least.
so we let's take this example that you had just mentioned, right? So you're using AI, you looked at the data, you put it together. When you're using it to understand the business, and then you use it to identify the performance outcomes. What would the performance outcomes be? So we know what we're hoping to achieve. How are you then leveraging AI to do whatever it is that needs to be done?
Yeah, so this is kind of when I think about, Kirkpatrick's levels of evaluation, right? We always want
Yeah,
to get to level 4, but unfortunately, a lot of the time we're going to get to level 1 with, the completion and the smile
yeah,
sheets and whatnot. So, I think there's nothing new with what I'm about to say relative to AI, but, it's about, starting with the business outcomes in mind. Is it
hmm,
revenue and sales and closing? Is it productivity? Is it employee or HR metrics like engagement and turnover, right? So understand kind of what are you trying to influence and then work backwards from there. What AI has done for us internally is it allows us to bring in all the different data sets that we have, whether it's, job descriptions, it's learner feedback surveys, it's performance data, it's learning data to help us construct. And what we've done is construct competency frameworks
mm,
for all of the major, roles that we train and develop. While we've known for a long time, there are, certain knowledge and skill sets that are required, but by combing through that data, we've identified other skills that we hadn't before that became really important or have been really important, but we'd never identified them before.
mm.
And AI has enabled us to do that. And it's enabled us to do it in a pretty incredibly fast way, but also a more thorough way. Because not only was it pulling in our internal data, and there's some of the examples I shared, but it's also able to bring in external benchmarks, right? Most
Mm-hmm.
organizations are not unique, right? If you're in a sales role or a customer service role or a warehouse role, there are some pretty common kind of
Yep.
knowledge, skills, and
Yeah.
abilities you require. So AI can call on that and kind of blend together your organizational context with what it knows to be best practices around those types of roles, to help determine kind of what is the roadmap for training, what is the knowledge that L&D should endeavor to kind of transfer, what are the skills that we should be focused on developing to influence the business outcomes that we're seeking to influence.
Mm-hmm. And then you're taking that, so you have this competency framework. How have you been able? Do you feel that AI is helping you get like to the bottom of it quicker? Like for you, is that the big takeaway on the first half? Is like I could probably get there. Like, do you think it's I can get there faster, or is able to draw correlations that I would have never been able to determine, even if given an unlimited amount of time?
I think it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
For us, working in a very fast-paced operation, sometimes it takes time to do this type of research and
Mm-hmm.
analysis to kind of guide the direction. But sometimes it can just pull in insights that, without kind of meaningful experience in that, across industries that you wouldn't be able to generate. So I think it's a bit of both, but I think mostly it's about, in some ways, mostly it's about speed, but in some ways it's also enabling a deeper and better quality of output as well,
Yeah.
with kind of more limited time.
So talking about the production end of it, how are you leveraging AI once you have all this defined? How are you using it to develop learning or in the flow of learning or as performance coaching? What are some of the things that you found to be have the most impact so far?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the areas that gets the most talk and
Yeah.
discussion. Obviously, it's some of the most exciting things because it's going beyond kind of text generation and doing some really exciting things. But for me, working in startup environments or startup like environments that are very fast in their pace, the concept of minimum viable product has always been pretty strong in my
Yeah.
organizational context, and it's about getting the content out there as quickly as possible. Not a lot of finesse and not a lot of kind of back and forth on the quality,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's just kind of 80/20, minimum viable product, get it out. And, for teams like mine, kind of lean organizations, it's sort of been a force multiplier. It's allowing us to continue to add the value we've been adding, but, give the work product a finesse and a level of quality that we just don't typically have the time to do. Right. So, we're using it in many ways, from building on the competency frameworks to build out, knowledge documentation, turning that into, so let's say, e-learning scripts, and even kind of now leveraging AI to build some of the e-learning for us and get it to a certain kind of state or first draft that we kind of tweak. We're using it to create voiceovers, human-like voiceovers, and this is a really exciting part of AI, which just a couple of years ago it wasn't quite there, but now it is.
Correct.
It's kind of wild when you listen to some of these voiceovers, and we're that confident with it that we've started using that. There are some technologies that are not quite there yet. At least I haven't looked at it in the last few months, so maybe it's gotten there. It's
Yeah.
going that quickly. But AI video avatars, I still have a bit of uncanny valley about them. So we are still keeping our eye on that, but we haven't explored that further at this point. But um, that's some of the ways that we've developed, content for delivery. And, there are a lot of other ways we're kind of building our content for assessments that I'll speak about as well. But in terms of delivery, kind of that's what we're really focused on.
Are you using like DeepL or 11 Labs for your voiceover or a different tool?
11 Labs,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
Storyline and programs like that are now integrating kind of that type
Correct.
of
Yeah.
technology, which is pretty comparable to 11 Labs and others.
Yeah, I think it's going to follow that classic arc of tech, right? Where you don't have where the best in classes are the worst in class for the first bit. Like storyline would be a good example, right? Like 11 labs would be much better than what you would get, but then eventually those tools catch up either by
Mm.
buying them, like Workday just bought Sana. There's acquisition every other day from any other company of these AI tools. So I think as that space gets more mature, you'll hopefully have these full stack providers have a lot better, tools within their tools themselves. I tell
Mm.
people, and again, I'm uh, by the time this is out, it's probably old data, but it's like I've yet to find that real magic bullet that people exist of tell me what you want to have done and I'll create a 15-minute training program for, right? Like end to end, it's some level of engaging. I've yet to find that exist. I got to
Mhm.
stitch together Claude to help me build a course outline or maybe Notebook LM. And then I got to use a visual tool, Adobe Firefly, whatever it is to create the visuals. Then I got to stitch together. Yeah. So it's not quite, I'm not quite there on the full service one. From video, I think video images, I think it can do all those things, but from my experience, you have to be a really advanced user to get something that isn't looking
Mm.
obviously AI, right? Like, so I think, when you see these videos, they're always posted, right? The second that one gets created, it's all over LinkedIn of, look, this is AI and it's
Mhm.
so easy to use. Well, you go on there and you try it. And like, if you, like, I went on there, I was like, okay, I'll buy the pro version of, I forgot what Google's video tool is called, VO or something like that.
Mm. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Whatever it was, it was the one where the avatars could sing and they could talk
Mhm.
and they looked real. And they're like, it actually wasn't that hard. It was like an hour of this. And I was like, no way is anybody getting this done. So yeah, we're still probably far out on that. A question though about the content, because I think we're in like a weird spot now where we're still leveraging AI to create the same type of learning that we're doing.
Mm.
How far out, or have you already started to see where you're leveraging AI to replace what you traditionally would have used like a storyline course for?
What I'm really excited about is organizations who are taking steps towards taking their, let's say, proprietary knowledge, right, and making it available as a
Yeah.
performance support, right?
Yep.
ChatGPT, for your organization, where it's got all your proprietary knowledge, it's got all your product knowledge, all of that in one place, and an employee who's on the spot and needs help, whether it's with knowledge or even skill development, can tap into that chatbot. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, as part of some of the ways that we're kind of measuring outcomes, we've been doing standard role plays for a long time. And to create a really good, solid role play, it does take time to think
Yeah.
through, the scenario and make sure it matches the performance outcomes and there's a good, solid rubric. So, AI is helping us do that much quicker. But what I'm really excited about is kind of AI role playing tools, right?
Correct.
I've been using it personally with ChatGPT, enabled in voice mode. And if I need to have a difficult conversation with an employee, I'm on there. This is the situation. This is the context. I'm going to go give me feedback, and it does that. But to take that concept and scale it across, a larger organization, we're in kind of late stage conversations right now with some vendors who we're kind of looking to kind of pilot this type of
Yeah.
technology,
Wonderful.
with almost 1,000 sales consultants, and the business model we have means there's fairly high turnover, unfortunately, and so we're always bringing new consultants in, and there are a lot of skills they need to develop pretty quickly, which means we have a ton of skills and a large audience that we need to scale that for, and it can be really challenging, and a lot of the time they, for many skills at least, they just need to figure it out on the job. But to kind of scale those types of role plays en masse is really exciting.
Yeah. We did this job for, it was a SaaS company and they were trying to do role plays for like a demo, and it was a pretty complex environment. And they're like, yeah, you like, listen, yeah, the role play is good, but it's not as good as a sales manager could do. And I said, you're 100% right. Tell me how many times your sales managers do demos and role plays, and can you share the feedback from the last 100? And they're like, well, that's just a matter of them not having time to do it. If we just gave them time, and I'm like, is something going to change
Hmm.
in the past 100 years of sales managers managing salespeople? Are they now going to have time to manage salespeople? Like, are
Right.
now they going to have time? And I'm like, you know, and so this is you know, a progress over perfection for me. If you're in a similar boat, yeah, you want to find the best that you can, of course, and there's a level where it's too subpar, it's not helping anybody. But I do think, eventually, because I think some pushback will come from the business of this isn't great, then you can say, well, listen, if your team's willing to commit to do it, then I'm willing to not invest. But if your team's not willing to commit to do it, well, this tool is better than that. This tool is better than inconsistent feedback. This tool is better than a bad manager giving a good employee feedback. So there's, I like to say sometimes AI, the sword seems to cut one way, but it really can cut both if you look at, well, like how often do your humans lie to you? Right? Like not intentionally, like for the most part, I
Yeah.
don't think employees are out there trying to lie. I don't think Claude is trying to lie to me or ChatGPT is trying to lie to me. They just are by the nature of trying to please me. You can't tell me that our employees aren't doing the same thing, right? They're trying to please us. Maybe they stretch the
Hmm.
truth, maybe they don't. So interesting. One, and I promised that we get out on time, but maybe really the way we can end, if you have the time, Matthew, is talking about measurement of the outcome.
Hmm.
So we've done this, we've implemented the training, we're doing all this. You mentioned the sales scenarios. And in short words, how are you leveraging AI to then measure, did all of the stuff I just did have an outcome on the business?
Yeah. You know, I think this is another example of not necessarily AI doing something we couldn't do. I think it's about AI doing something we just have never had the time to do and do very
Yeah.
well, right?
Yeah.
So, AI is providing at least us in L&D to provide, the business true tangible evidence of, you know, learning outcomes influencing business performance. And, I mentioned a little earlier about the certification or competency frameworks that we've built out. And, we've used the concept of certification for a while internally. We're going to get them certified on that product or certified on that skill. And it's usually a binary thing. You're either certified or you're not, right? We're taking that
Yeah.
concept and kind of exploring it further with proficiency levels, right? Kind of think about Kirkpatrick's levels of evaluation as well, right? So
Hmm.
we can get someone to a level one proficiency, by doing an e-learn, doing some knowledge transfer and a knowledge check, right? So Gen AI is helping us with creating those knowledge checks really quickly. Here's a
Yeah.
10-page script from the course, identify a 10-question knowledge check really quickly, right?
Good point. Really good point. Yeah.
um, a level two evaluation, which is what we call kind of you can do it in a safe learning environment, a training room, right? So
Mm.
building out kind of really robust and quality role-playing scenarios with kind of very unique customer scenarios tied to our products, right?
Yeah.
With a really strong rubric connected to the competency framework, right? Then providing managers on the job assessment tools as well to say, all right, they've done it in a safe learning environment. It's your job manager to use this one pager to verify they can go do it on the job, right? And then ultimately kind of scaling up to 5 levels of proficiency, 3 being proficient, they're demonstrating they're doing it on the job using these
Mm.
tools that AI is helping us create really quickly. The level 4 is the business metric we're attempting to influence, right? So the idea being if we did our job accurately, if you're doing that skill consistently, right, on the job, you should be influencing that KPI. And then, providing the managers the direct correlation between that skill and the KPI to influence whether they are now skilled or not because they're now hitting their targets on their KPI. And then we reserve a fifth layer for those kind of experts, those who are so strong at that skill that they're coaching and teaching others, and we reward them and recognize them with that kind of expert level status. So, that's some of the ways we're doing that. But, we've been using a video role playing tool for a long time. We're excited to pivot
Mm.
from that to an AI role playing tool, but we've been using video role playing for a long time. And AI is now allowing us to take all the data for thousands of people who've been using the tool over the years, right? And then looking at their performance. And we've clear, tangible connection to learning and performance outcomes. Those
Mm.
who have engaged into the role-playing activities more than those who have not had a 2% greater margin in their sales closing than those who didn't.
Whoa.
2% may not sound like a lot, but when you're talking about
No.
millions of
Yeah.
dollars, it's a huge. So Gen AI is now enabling us to connect, the learning data with the performance data.
Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing application from like very simple, like you said, like build out my knowledge set, like get the level 1 and level 2 out of the way. Like
Hmm.
I don't want to waste a second on it. Just get that
Hmm.
done, and then let's
Yeah.
focus on the tools, building the tools for level 3 and 4. Really good. Well, Navi, thank you so much for giving us some time to talk about real world application of AI that is just so needed. So I appreciate you investing your time. For those listening, obviously Matthew's on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with him. He's a beacon of knowledge for us. So thanks, Matthew, for stopping by and giving us some time.
Thank you, Nolan, for having me on. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Catch you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, Nolan.